Francisco Franco Bahamonde, known historically as General Franco, was born on December 4, 1892, in the coastal town of El Ferrol, located in the province of Galicia in northwestern Spain. His father, Nicolas Franco, came from an Andalusian lineage with a long-standing tradition of naval service dating back to the early 1700s. Nicolas upheld this family heritage by serving as an officer in the Spanish Naval Administrators Corps during the late 1800s. However, his erratic and indulgent personality created a strained relationship with his son, who grew to disapprove of these traits. Franco's mother, Maria del Pilar Bahamonde de Andrade, was a well-off Galician woman from the upper middle class. Franco developed a deep bond with her, admiring her devout Catholicism and solemn nature, which stood in stark contrast to his father's behavior. From a young age, Franco began to display a disciplined and serious temperament. Initially, it was expected that he would join the Spanish Navy, continuing the family tradition. But in 1907, when Franco was only 14, his father abandoned the family and later remarried in Madrid, a betrayal Franco never forgave. Their relationship remained distant thereafter. It was around this time, amid personal upheaval, that Franco abandoned plans to enter naval service. This was also influenced by the declining state of the Spanish Navy following the disastrous Spanish-American War of 1898. Instead, he enrolled in the Spanish Infantry Academy in Toledo at the age of 14. Franco completed his studies in 1910, graduating as a second lieutenant. Though he ranked low in his class, this was partly due to his young age compared to older cadets. Spain, at that time, was on the edge of ongoing political instability. Once the dominant European power in the 16th century, supported by vast colonial wealth from the Americas, Spain began to decline in the 17th century as these resources dwindled. By the 18th century, it had become a secondary power with a stagnating. The early 1800s saw independence movements in Latin America that stripped Spain of most of its colonies. Still, reform movements emerged. During the Napoleonic era, Spanish reformers sought to modernize the country, producing the liberal constitution of 1812. Yet, tensions persisted, leading to civil strife, such as the First Carlist War, 1833-1840, rooted in succession disputes and ideological divisions. Two more Carlist wars followed, one in the 1840s and another in the 1870s, with the third briefly replacing the monarchy with the First Spanish Republic, 1874. By the time Franco was born in 1892, Spain had been shaped by nearly a century of conflict between liberals pushing for reform and conservatives defending traditional forces that would influence Franco's path deeply. When Franco began his military career in 1910, Spain's most pressing concern lay not at home but abroad in its remaining African colonies. Having lost most overseas holdings in the Caribbean and Asia by the 1890s, Spain was focused on Morocco, where it had historic holdings like Ceuta. Following minor conflicts with local tribes in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Spain formalized its control over northern Morocco in 1912 through a treaty with France. France took the central interior, while Spain acquired the northern and southern coastal strips. Although the treaty defined their spheres of influence, actual control over these regions proved difficult, requiring extended military campaigns. Franco, just 19 at the time, volunteered to serve in Morocco in 1912. His assignment marked the beginning of his rapid rise. In 1913, he became a first lieutenant in an elite cavalry unit, gaining a reputation for leadership and care for his men. By 1915, he was a captain, the youngest in Spain's army. However, he was seriously wounded in 1916 and returned to Spain to recover. Franco returned to North Africa in the early 1920s, following the creation of the Spanish Foreign Legion in 1920, where he served as deputy commander. The Rif War, 1921 to 1926, a major conflict with Berber tribes, soon followed. Franco proved vital in this campaign and was promoted to lead the Legion in 1923. That same year, he married Maria del Carmen Polo, with whom he had a daughter, also named Maria del Carmen, in 1926, his only child. In 1923, his growing prominence earned him an audience with King Alfonso XIII. This occurred just as the king sanctioned a military coup by General Miguel Primo de Rivera, who governed with the motto, "Country, Religion, Monarchy." Back in Morocco, Franco played a key role in concluding the Rif War successfully by 1926. His efforts were recognized with a promotion to Brigadier General at just 33, making him one of Europe's youngest generals. In 1928, he was made director of the new General Military Academy in Zaragoza. His North African achievements and the influence he gained at the academy laid the groundwork for his later rise. The collapse of Primo de Rivera's government in early 1930, due to economic troubles and popular discontent, led to political chaos. In April 1931, municipal elections saw Republicans claim over 40% of the vote, overshadowing the monarchists. Seen as a referendum on the monarchy, King Alfonso XIII left Spain 2 days later without abdicating. The Second Spanish Republic was declared on the same day, ending the monarchy. The new republic initiated broad reforms in society, religion, and the military. Franco, closely tied to the monarchy and de Rivera's regime, was removed from his position at the academy and reassigned to lesser posts. Though he disagreed with the republic's goals, Franco pledged to cooperate with the new regime. Nonetheless, he was sidelined in the early years of Republican rule. The Republic suffered from deep internal divisions, facing unrest and attempted coups. In 1933, a conservative alliance called the Spanish Confederation of the Autonomous Right won elections, shifting power away from the liberals. Franco's fortunes improved as a result, and he was promoted to Major General in 1934. That October, he led government forces in quelling a miners' uprising in Asturias. His success earned him the position of Chief of the Army's General Staff by May 1935. Franco viewed the Asturias uprising as a leftist assault on civilization, revealing his staunch anti-communist and conservative beliefs. His ideological stance aligned with growing tensions in Spain, which intensified further in 1936, after a string of scandals led to new elections. By now, Spanish politics had polarized into two main blocs: a left-wing popular front of socialists, communists and radicals, and a right-wing alliance of monarchists, conservatives and ultra-Catholics. Despite strong rightist support from the military and colonial officers, the Popular Front triumphed in February 1936, and Manuel Azaña was appointed president. Franco, now posted to the Canary Islands in a virtual political exile, had largely avoided partisan politics. But, in the wake of Azaña's appointment, right-wing military officers began organizing a coup. Though approached by these conspirators, Franco hesitated. In June 1936, he met them secretly in a forest in Tenerife to discuss the rebellion. He initially declined to commit, but over the following weeks he agreed to join the plot. The uprising was orchestrated by three key leaders: General José Sanjurjo, a monarchist exiled in Portugal and a prominent critic of the Second Republic, was selected as its figurehead. Emilio Mola y Vidal, the first Duke of Mola, coordinated operations on the Spanish mainland, while Francisco Franco assumed control of the colonial troops stationed in North Africa. The Spanish Civil War officially commenced on July 17, 1936, one day ahead of schedule when the Army of Africa revolted in Morocco. The next day, Franco flew from the Canary Islands to Morocco as rebel units began taking control of strategic regions across Spain. By the month's end, these insurgents, soon collectively known as the Nationalists, had gained strongholds throughout North Africa and cities such as Zaragoza, Seville, Burgos, Valladolid, Burgos, and Pamplona. Despite this, the Republican-aligned government retained major urban centers, including Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia, Malaga, and Bilbao. The country became deeply divided, setting the stage for an extended and devastating civil war. This internal strife quickly attracted international involvement, escalating into a broader ideological clash. The Soviet Union and other communist entities provided crucial support to the Republicans, while Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy backed the Nationalists with arms, troops, and resources. Although nations like Britain, France, and the United States proclaimed neutrality, many of their citizens defied official policy, forming international brigades to fight for either side. As a result, the Spanish Civil War effectively became a proxy battleground in the intensifying ideological war between right and left across Europe. Preceding the outbreak of World War II, it also served as a proving ground for new military technologies, particularly modernized aircraft, which had evolved dramatically since World War I. The conflict soon morphed into a drawn-out war of attrition. After securing Spanish-controlled territories in North Africa by late July 1936, Franco began transporting around 30,000 troops to Andalusia in southern Spain. He launched a campaign to capture Madrid, hoping a quick victory would end the war. But by the time his forces neared Madrid in October, the Republicans had received substantial assistance from the Soviet Union, enabling them to hold the capital. Franco's dream of a swift nationalist triumph faded. As 1936 came to a close and 1937 unfolded, the war's tempo slowed into a grueling standoff. The Nationalists established a provisional government in Burgos, a historically significant city north of Madrid and former capital of Castile. On October 1, 1936, Franco was appointed Generalissimo of the Nationalist forces. His rise to undisputed leadership accelerated following the deaths of his two fellow conspirators. Sanjurjo perished in a plane crash en route from Portugal on July 20, and Mola died under similar circumstances on June 3, 1937, when poor weather forced his plane into a mountainside near Vitoria in the Basque region. These tragedies left Franco as the sole leader of the nationalist faction, paving the way for his authoritarian rule after the war. A significant political transformation also occurred in 1937. The Falange Española, a far-right fascist party inspired by German and Italian models, had been formed in 1934. Initially unaffiliated with the group, Franco merged the Falange with other conservative and monarchist factions in April 1937, creating a new entity, the Falange Española las Tradicionalista y de las Juntas de Ofensiva Nacional Sindicalista, an ultra-nationalist party that dominated Spanish politics until the 1970s. From that point, Franco firmly controlled the nationalist cause. Militarily, the nationalists had also solidified their hold over much of western Spain, including key cities such as León and Coruña in the north, and Seville and Granada in the south. In contrast, the Republicans retained coastal territories in the east, the Basque region in the northeast, and central Spain around Madrid. In 1937, much of the fighting concentrated in the Basque region. The campaign reached its most infamous point in April with the aerial bombardment of Guernica, a tragic and controversial event. Executed by Germany's Condor Legion and Italy's Legionary Air Force, the raid resulted in the deaths of hundreds of civilians and facilitated Franco's later seizure of Bilbao. Though casualty estimates vary, some reports suggest as many as 1,000 people died, predominantly non-combatants. This massacre is widely regarded as the worst nationalist atrocity of the war. Following Guernica, the nationalists rapidly secured the Basque country. Bilbao was taken on June 19, 1937, after a prolonged siege, and by October, all of northern Spain was under Franco's control. Nevertheless, the Republicans retained influence over central and eastern Spain, including Barcelona. The war's decisive period came in 1938. At the end of 1937, the Republicans launched a bold attack to reclaim Teruel, a city in eastern Aragon. Capturing it would secure Catalonia and force Franco to shift focus away from Madrid. In response, both sides amassed over 100,000 troops each, transforming Teruel into the site of brutal combat during one of Spain's harshest winters in decades. The Republicans temporarily gained control in January 1938, but Franco's counterattack retook the city by mid-February, resulting in a combined 120,000 casualties. Though Teruel held limited strategic value, its psychological and material toll weakened Republican capabilities. Franco seized the opportunity to go on the offensive. By March 1938, he launched a drive toward the Mediterranean, splitting Republican territory in two. By mid-April, nationalist troops reached Catalonia and Valencia, and the Republicans began to seek peace by early summer. By then, they held only the Meseta region to Valencia and an isolated enclave centered on Barcelona. The final phase began in late 1938. On December 23, Franco's forces invaded Catalonia, swiftly overpowering Republican defenders. Tarragona was taken on January 15, 1939, and Barcelona followed on January 26. With these major losses, it became evident that Republican resistance was collapsing. Britain and France soon recognized Franco's regime as Spain's legitimate government. On March 6, Republican Prime Minister Juan Negrin fled to France as military leaders sought an armistice. Franco's last offensive began in late March, culminating with the capture of Madrid on March 28 and Valencia 2 days later. On April 1, 1939, Franco addressed the nation via radio, announcing the end of the war. That same day, Alicante fell, and after nearly 3 years, the Spanish Civil War officially concluded, with Franco emerging as Spain's ruler. The immediate post-war period was marked by retribution. It's estimated that more than 30,000 Republicans were executed in the months after the war ended. Tens of thousands more were imprisoned, and roughly 500,000 refugees escaped across the Pyrenees into France, while others fled to South America. Persecution of Republicans and their families persisted for years, leaving a dark legacy of repression under Franco's rule. Franco's ambitions to restore Spain were immediately disrupted by unfolding events across Europe involving his former allies. Nazi Germany's participation in the Spanish Civil War was part of a broader expansionist agenda. The Rhineland was remilitarized in 1936, followed by the annexation of Austria in 1938, and the dismantling of Czechoslovakia in 1939. While Britain and France tried appeasing Hitler, the invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, finally prompted both nations to declare war. One might have expected Franco to join the Axis, given the support he received from Hitler and Mussolini. However, Spain remained officially neutral during World War II. In late 1939, Spain was too devastated from its own war to re-engage in global conflict. But as Germany swept through Western Europe in 1940, Franco showed signs of leaning toward the Axis. In October of that year, he met with Hitler in Hendaye to discuss terms for Spanish involvement. Franco demanded economic aid and territorial promises, including Gibraltar and parts of French North Africa, but Hitler refused to meet these conditions. With talks unsuccessful, Franco adopted a cautious and pragmatic approach. He permitted Spanish volunteers of the Blue Division to join Germany's Eastern Front campaign against the USSR, but kept Spain out of direct conflict with Britain and the US. Additionally, Franco stationed troops in the Pyrenees to prevent any potential German occupation of Spain, maintaining a delicate neutrality for the rest of the war. Franco notably adjusted his position in response to the shifting tides of World War II, particularly by 1942 and 1943, when Germany's advance on the Eastern Front had been halted and then reversed by Soviet forces, pushing westward. Sensing the Axis powers were heading toward defeat, Franco adopted a stricter stance of neutrality and began to extend more cooperation to the Allied powers from 1943 onwards. Allied airmen who escaped to Spain from Nazi-occupied France were granted safe transit back home via Spanish territory. This policy earned the gratitude of prominent Allied leaders such as Britain's Winston Churchill and America's Franklin D. Roosevelt. However, Franco's earlier alignment with Axis ideologies meant Spain was excluded from the newly formed United Nations after the war and remained barred until 1955. Following the end of World War II in 1945, Spain entered a rare phase free from both internal and international conflict for the first time in nearly 10 years. The period from 1945 to Franco's death in 1975, despite his autocratic rule, became one of the longest stretches of internal political stability in modern Spanish history. Known as Francoist Spain, the nation was governed with Franco at its apex, holding the title of Caudillo de España, or leader of Spain. Though clearly a dictatorship, the regime evolved after World War II into a more optimistic one. While Franco had aligned with Hitler and Mussolini during the Spanish Civil War, his own ideology wasn't purely fascist. Rather, it was a military-led authoritarian regime, grounded in core conservative values that had existed in Spanish politics since the 1800s, notably nationalism, devout Catholicism, and a staunch anti-leftist stance. The only political organization permitted from 1939 to the mid-1000s, 970s, was the Falange Española, which Franco formed in 1937 from various right-wing factions. Yet, by the post-war era, it had begun shedding its fascist elements, undergoing a symbolic transformation in 1958 into the Movimiento Nacional, or national movement. Despite a gradual distancing from outright fascism, Franco's government remained highly repressive. Trade unions and left-leaning organizations were surveilled and suppressed, with socialist groups largely outlawed. His administration cracked down heavily on regional separatist aspirations, particularly in the Basque Country and Catalonia, an issue that has long marked Spanish political life. These efforts to quash regionalism often had the opposite effect. In the Basque region, for instance, state repression led to the emergence in 1959 of the Euskadi Ta Askatasuna, ETA meaning Basque Homeland and Liberty, which developed into a violent paramilitary group known for terrorism and assassination. Among the regime's most disturbing actions was the state-sanctioned abduction of children from families who supported the Republicans. This was part of a broader attempt at ideological re-engineering, relocating children likely to be raised as leftists to conservative, nationalist households. The practice began during the Civil War, particularly with orphaned children, but intensified later to include those whose parents were imprisoned. Continuing into the 1950s, it affected tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of children, many of whom were permanently separated from their birth families. Known today as the lost children of Francoism, this remains one of the regime's gravest human rights violations. Meanwhile, during the 1940s and 1950s, the Catholic Church's dominance over Spanish life was further reinforced through Franco's alliance with the clergy. The Church was granted control over the education system, including universities where academic appointments were vetted for religious adherence. Society-wide, practices like divorce, birth control, and abortion were outlawed. Women, who had gained significant rights under the earlier Second Republic, saw many of these gains reversed. Traditional gender roles were legally enforced, and women often needed male approval to engage in basic activities like working certain jobs or opening bank accounts. In the realm of foreign policy, the late 1950s brought changes to Spain's overseas territories in North Africa. In 1956, Spain relinquished some of its holdings, in tandem with France granting Moroccan independence. However, tensions erupted in 1957 between Spain and the newly independent Morocco, leading to the Ifni War. This 8-month conflict resulted in Spain ceding Tafaya in 1958, and more territories followed in later years. Spain also granted independence to Equatorial Guinea in 1968 and began withdrawing from the Spanish Sahara in 1975, shortly before Franco's death. Though most of its African colonies were relinquished, Spain still holds onto a few enclaves, such as Ceuta and Melilla. Over time, the harshest elements of Franco's rule began to wane. As memories of the Civil War faded, repression lessened. The White Terror, the brutal targeting of Republicans, diminished in the 1940s, largely because most opposition had been wiped out. Concentration camps for Republican prisoners, like the one at Miranda de Ebro, were gradually shut down, the last closing in 1947. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, Spain saw unofficial trade unions operating with minimal suppression, something unthinkable in the earlier years. The regime also eased some of its restrictions on women's roles and slightly relaxed press censorship, although direct criticism of the state remained punishable. This modest liberalization can be partially attributed to Spain aligning more with Western capitalist nations, especially the US during the Cold War from the mid-1950s onward. As Spain became integrated into the Western Bloc, Franco's rule softened in key areas, reflecting a broader shift in domestic policy. Nowhere are the contradictions of Franco's governance more evident than in his approach to the economy. While politically oppressive, his regime achieved undeniable economic progress. Since the late 1600s, Spain had lagged economically, plagued by outdated farming and underdeveloped industry. The Civil War had further devastated its economy, and during the 1940s, Spain teetered on the edge of financial ruin. Only a slow recovery followed. Yet by the late 1950s, Spain's economy began to surge in what is now termed El Milagro Español, or the Spanish Miracle. From then until the early 1970s, Spain's economy was the second fastest growing in the world, trailing only Japan. This transformation was driven by liberalized market reforms in 1959, and a series of strategic development plans. Heavy industries like steel and shipbuilding flourished, especially in the north, while petrochemicals and automotive manufacturing expanded rapidly. The Seat car company, for instance, played a crucial role, with car ownership soaring from around 70,000 in 1946 to over 1 million by the mid-1960s. Nearly 1 million Seat cars were produced during this boom. By the end of Franco's rule, Spain had risen to become the 9th largest economy globally. Although this rapid growth slowed during the global recessions of the late 1970s, the foundation had been laid for modern economic development, including a growing tourism sector. Regardless of the regime's abuses, this economic modernization is a major part of Franco's legacy. Another key aspect to understanding Franco's rule is his decision not to establish a dynastic dictatorship. This was likely influenced by his lack of a male heir. His only child, Maria del Carmen, was a daughter. Had he had a son, he might have planned to pass power down. Still, as early as 1947, Franco held a referendum to reinstate the monarchy, which passed, although no monarch was immediately installed. Instead, Franco retained the powers of a lifelong regent. As he aged, he took more concrete steps toward monarchy restoration. In 1969, he named Juan Carlos, a descendant of the Bourbon dynasty, as his successor and declared him prince. Prior to this, Spain had begun moving toward limited electoral reform with legislative changes in 1967. In 1973, Franco stepped down as prime minister, handing the role to longtime ally Luis Carrero Blanco. However, was assassinated by ETA just months later. Two more figures, Torcuato Fernández Miranda and Carlos Arias Navarro, would fill the role before Franco's death. Even after relinquishing some duties, Franco retained the key roles of head of state and military commander. Still, the reforms introduced from the late 1960s onward marked a cautious move toward a less autocratic future. Upon Franco's passing in 1975, Spain rapidly transitioned into a democratic state. This shift would take place during the mid-1970s. By the close of the 1960s, Franco was nearing 80, and his physical condition had significantly deteriorated. His health worsened further into the following decade, partly due to his battle with Parkinson's disease. By 1974, he was periodically too unwell to fulfill his responsibilities, prompting Prince Juan Carlos to temporarily take over some official duties. Franco's final public appearance was on the 1st of October 1975, when he delivered a speech in Madrid and appeared notably weak. A few weeks later, he lost consciousness and was placed on life support. Debate persists over whether he died late on the 19th of November or early on the 20th, with causes attributed either to heart failure or septic shock. He was interred at the Valley of the Fallen, a monumental crypt near Madrid, created to honor the Civil War dead. Recently, however, his remains were removed from this site and reburied in a private family tomb on Madrid's outskirts. Although Juan Carlos initially voiced support for preserving Franco's political structure, he swiftly moved to undo the dictatorship once Franco passed away in the early winter of 1975. Over the next 3 years, a constitutional monarchy replaced the old regime. On 15 June 1977, Spain held its first free and democratic general election since 1936, with centrist and left-leaning candidates achieving significant success. A clear indication of Spain's political transformation from its former right-wing governance. Just 18 months after that, Spain ratified a new constitution in December 1978, which remains the foundation of its current democratic monarchy. A failed coup attempt in February 1981 by military factions seeking a return to autocracy revealed just how decisively the nation had moved toward liberal democracy in the aftermath of Franco's rule. General Francisco Franco is arguably the most complex figure among Europe's 20th century authoritarian rulers. He rose to prominence after leading a brutal civil war, with his conservative, militaristic faction earning international condemnation for events such as the bombing of Guernica in 1937 and for their alliances with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy during the 1930s and 1940s. Franco's regime was responsible for countless atrocities, especially in the post-war period, when mass executions of Republicans were commonplace in Spanish courts. Any serious evaluation of his legacy must begin with this violent history. Still, his rule did evolve over time. From the 1950s onward, the nature of his regime shifted from openly totalitarian to more moderately authoritarian. Spain also experienced significant social and economic developments during the final decades of his leadership. After joining the United Nations in 1955, Franco's government cultivated stronger ties with the US and its allies, aligning with the Western Bloc during the Cold War. Most notably, Spain underwent an economic boom between 1959 and the mid-70s, often referred to as the Spanish Miracle. This period of prosperity lifted the nation out of its long-standing economic decline, raising living standards for many Spaniards. While this doesn't absolve Franco of his crimes, it forms a part of his historical impact. As for Franco's personal nature, he remains an enigmatic figure. Reserved and secretive, the true essence of Francisco Franco is hard to pin down. He may best be understood as a product of his country's political turmoil, adjusting his beliefs to fit broader global and regional shifts from the 1930s through the 1970s. Prior to the Civil War, he was a vocal defender of traditional Spanish conservatism, a political identity that had existed since the 1800s. He was also deeply anti-communist, a stance that remained central to his ideology throughout his 4 decades in power. Despite his collaborations with leaders like Hitler and Mussolini, Franco was arguably not a pure fascist. His government began to moderate its policies during the 1950s, eventually aligning more closely with Western democracies as Cold War geopolitics made Spain a valuable right-wing partner. Ultimately, Franco may be seen as a political shapeshifter, someone molded by Spain's chaotic politics during the deeply polarized first half of the 20th century. What's your opinion on General Franco? Should history judge him solely by the brutalities of the 1930s and 40s, or do the changes he brought in later years alter that picture? Share your thoughts in the comments, and as always, thank you for watching.